Imagine the flames roaring in the dead of night. A billionaire husband laughing maniacally as he tosses his pregnant wife's entire wardrobe into a blazing bonfire. Maternity dresses curling into ash while his smirking mistress films it all for her twisted social media thrill. That's the gut-wrenching betrayal that shattered Elena Harrington's world. A 48-year-old powerhouse attorney who had sacrificed everything for their empire. But this isn't just a story of heartbreak. It's an epic tale of revenge, resilience, and courtroom triumph that will leave you cheering. From discovering hidden affairs and offshore schemes to battling gaslighting and death threats, Elena turns the tables in a high-stakes divorce that exposes her husband's billion-dollar fraud. Watch as she rises from the ashes, reclaiming her life, her fortune, and her dignity, proving that no woman is ever truly powerless. If you've ever felt betrayed or underestimated, this real inspired drama will hit home and inspire you to fight back. Hit that like button if you're rooting for Elena. Share this with a friend who's been through hell. Drop a comment below sharing your own empowerment story. We read everyone, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these gripping tales of justice served. Buckle up, her win is about to blow your mind. The flames danced against the twilight sky of the Harrington estate, casting eerie shadows across the manicured gardens that had once been Elena's pride and joy. From her bedroom window on the second floor, she watched in stunned horror as her husband Victor fed her maternity clothes into the bonfire he had built on their stone patio. Each designer dress, each carefully selected outfit for her growing belly, disappeared into the hungry flames while his mistress Sophia laughed beside him, filming the destruction on her phone. Elena Harrington pressed her palm against the cool glass, her other hand instinctively protecting the 7-month swell of her pregnancy. At 48, this baby represented everything she had dreamed of: a second chance at motherhood after years of focusing on Victor's empire, a symbol of the love she thought they still shared, despite the growing distance between them. Now, watching her clothes turn to ash, she felt that dream crumbling just as surely as the delicate fabrics in the fire below. "How did we get here?" she whispered to herself, her breath fogging the window. The question seemed to echo through the vast bedroom that had once felt like a sanctuary, but now felt more like a prison. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had once been one of the most feared corporate attorneys in New York, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals and faced down ruthless opponents in boardrooms across the country, now stood powerless in her own home. 20 years. 20 years of marriage, of building Victor's tech empire from a small startup to a global corporation worth over $10 billion. 20 years of networking events, charity galas, and business dinners where she had been the perfect wife, the gracious hostess, the brilliant partner who could discuss market strategies as easily as she could plan a dinner party for 50. She had given up her own thriving law practice to support his vision, convinced that their partnership was unbreakable. The memory of their early days together flooded back as she watched the fire consume the last of her maternity wardrobe. They had met at a legal conference in Chicago when she was 28 and he was 35. He had been a scrappy entrepreneur then, full of revolutionary ideas about how technology could transform communication. She had been a rising star at one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms, known for her sharp intellect and unwavering determination. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of late-night conversations about changing the world, passionate debates about justice and innovation, and dreams of building something extraordinary together. Victor had been different then, attentive, thoughtful, genuinely interested in her opinions and dreams. He would send her handwritten notes between meetings, flowers that referenced inside jokes from their conversations, small gestures that made her feel seen and valued. When he proposed on the rooftop of their first apartment, a modest one-bedroom in Brooklyn that they could barely afford, he had promised her they would build their empire together as equals. "You're my secret weapon," he had whispered that night, sliding the simple diamond ring onto her finger. "With your brilliant mind and my vision, there's nothing we can't accomplish." For the first decade of their marriage, that promise had seemed prophetic. Elena had been instrumental in negotiating the deals that allowed Victor's company to grow from a small startup to a major player in the tech industry. She had reviewed every contract, advised on every major decision, and used her legal expertise to navigate the complex world of intellectual property, mergers, and acquisitions that had built their fortune. They had been a true partnership, working 18-hour days side by side, celebrating every victory together. But success, Elena had learned, could be as dangerous as failure. As Victor's company grew, so did his ego. The man who had once valued her input on everything began making unilateral decisions. The husband who had once treasured their quiet evenings discussing philosophy and literature started coming home later and later, claiming he needed to network and maintain relationships that were crucial to the business. The changes had been gradual at first, a forgotten anniversary here, a missed birthday there. Business trips that seemed to grow longer and more frequent. Elena had told herself it was temporary, the natural cost of building something extraordinary. She had thrown herself into the role of supporting him, organizing charity events that enhanced their public image, managing their multiple homes, and maintaining the social connections that were crucial to their continued success. When they had started trying to have children in their early 30s, Elena had been devastated by years of failed attempts, miscarriages, and ultimately the diagnosis that natural conception would be nearly impossible. Victor had been supportive then, holding her through the grief, agreeing to try various treatments, but as the years passed and their fortune grew, the topic of children had gradually faded from their conversations, replaced by discussions of acquisitions, market opportunities, and the endless demands of their increasingly public lives. Elena had channeled her nurturing instincts into their business, treating Victor's employees like an extended family, mentoring young women in the company, and using their wealth to support educational initiatives for underprivileged children. She had convinced herself that this was enough, that being part of something larger than themselves was its own form of legacy. The pregnancy had been a complete surprise. After nearly 15 years of believing motherhood was impossible, the positive test had felt like a miracle. Elena had been overwhelmed with joy, seeing it as a gift that would bring her and Victor closer together, a chance to finally have the family they had always dreamed of. She had imagined lazy Sunday mornings with their child, family vacations to exotic locations, the joy of watching Victor become a father. But Victor's reaction had been lukewarm at best. He had smiled and said all the right things, but Elena had sensed his lack of enthusiasm. He had seemed more concerned about how the pregnancy might affect their social schedule than excited about becoming a father. Still, she had convinced herself that once the baby arrived, he would fall in love with fatherhood just as she had fallen in love with the idea of being a mother. The first signs of his affair had been subtle. Sofia Martinez had joined their social circle about 18 months ago, a striking 32-year-old socialite from a prominent Spanish family who had moved to New York to launch her own fashion consulting business. She was beautiful in that effortless way that came from good genes, inexpensive maintenance, glossy dark hair, perfect skin, and a figure that looked stunning in everything from designer gowns to casual weekend wear. Initially, Elena had genuinely liked Sofia. She was intelligent, well-traveled, and seemed to share Elena's interest in art and literature. They had bonded over their shared love of classical music and had even discussed collaborating on a charity auction to benefit arts education. Sofia had been charming and deferential, always complimenting Elena's style and seeking her advice about navigating New York's social scene. But gradually, Elena had begun to notice the subtle ways Sofia positioned herself near Victor at parties, the way her hand lingered on his arm when she spoke to him, the knowing smiles they exchanged across crowded rooms. She had tried to dismiss her growing unease as pregnancy hormones and insecurity, telling herself she was being paranoid. The first concrete evidence had come 3 weeks ago, when Elena was organizing Victor's home office for a magazine photo shoot. While moving some papers, she had found a receipt for a dinner at Daniel, one of the city's most romantic restaurants, on a night when Victor had told her he was having a business dinner with potential investors. The receipt showed 2 entrees, 2 desserts, and a bottle of wine that cost more than most people made in a month. When she had asked him about it casually, he had brushed off her questions, claiming he couldn't remember every business dinner. 2 days later, she had found a jewelry receipt in his jacket pocket, a Cartier bracelet worth $40,000, purchased on the same day he had given her a perfunctory kiss goodbye and claimed he would be in meetings all day. When the bracelet hadn't appeared as a gift for her, Elena's suspicions had crystallized into painful certainty. The confrontation had been devastating. Elena had approached it like the skilled attorney she had once been, calmly presenting her evidence and asking for an explanation. But Victor's response had shocked her with its coldness. Instead of denying the affair or showing remorse, he had attacked her, calling her hormonal and irrational, suggesting that pregnancy had made her paranoid and clingy. "You're not the woman I married, Elena," he had said, his voice cold and clinical. That Elena was confident, successful, independent. "This version of you is needy and suspicious. Maybe you should consider what that says about you." The words had cut deeper than any physical blow could have. To have her intelligence and intuition dismissed so casually by the man she had loved and supported for 20 years felt like a fundamental betrayal of everything they had built together. But worse than his denial was the hint of something darker in his tone, a suggestion that somehow she was to blame for his infidelity. That conversation had taken place 5 days ago. Since then, Victor had become increasingly brazen about his relationship with Sophia, taking calls from her in Elena's presence, claiming sudden business trips that Elena knew were romantic getaways. The burning of her maternity clothes tonight felt like the culmination of a campaign designed to humiliate and demoralize her. As Elena watched the last pieces of fabric turn to ash, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Victor's voice carried down the hallway, loud and cheerful in a way that made her stomach clench. "Did you see Sophia's story? She's got such a great eye for drama. This is going to be perfect for her feed." The casual cruelty in his tone, discussing the destruction of his pregnant wife's wardrobe as content for his mistress's social media, finally broke through Elena's paralysis. She turned from the window, her reflection in the glass showing a woman she barely recognized. Gone was the confident, polished Elena Harrington, who had graced magazine covers and commanded respect in boardrooms. In her place stood a woman whose eyes reflected a pain so deep it seemed to echo through her soul. But beneath that pain, something else was stirring. As Elena looked at her reflection, she began to see traces of the woman she had been before she became Mrs. Victor Harrington, the attorney who had never lost a case, the negotiator who could find weakness in any opponent's position, the strategist who could plan campaigns that seemed impossible and execute them flawlessly. Victor appeared in the doorway, his 6-foot frame filling the space. At 55, he was still an imposing man, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, his custom suit immaculate despite his recent activity around the fire. His pale blue eyes, which Elena had once found mesmerizing, now seemed cold and calculating. "Elena, there you are. Sophia and I were just discussing plans for the weekend. We're thinking of taking the yacht out to the Hamptons. You don't mind staying here, do you? You should probably rest anyway, given your condition." The casual assumption that she would simply accept being abandoned while he vacationed with his mistress was perhaps the most insulting thing of all. Elena studied her husband's face, searching for any trace of the man she had fallen in love with, but found only a stranger wearing Victor's features. "My condition." Elena's voice was steady, controlled, the tone she had once used to cross-examine hostile witnesses. "You mean my pregnancy with your child?" Victor waved dismissively. "You know what I mean. You've been emotional lately, and the stress isn't good for the baby. A quiet weekend here might be exactly what you need." "What I need," Elena said slowly, "is for my husband to explain why he just burned several $1,000s worth of maternity clothes in our backyard while his mistress filmed it for her social media." For a moment, Victor looked genuinely surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to challenge him directly. Then his expression hardened into the mask of cold authority she had seen him use on business competitors. "I think pregnancy has affected your judgment more than I realized," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone she had grown to despise. "Those weren't your clothes being burned. I was disposing of some old furniture that was damaged in storage. If you're seeing things that aren't there, maybe we should call Dr. Peterson and have him adjust your medication." The gaslighting was so blatant, so insulting to her intelligence, that Elena almost laughed. But she recognized the tactic for what it was, an attempt to make her question her own perceptions, to undermine her confidence in her ability to trust what she had seen with her own eyes. "Victor," she said quietly, "I watched you from this window. I saw you take my maternity dresses from the closet. I saw Sophia laughing and filming while you burned them. I'm not delusional, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw." Something dangerous flickered in Victor's eyes. For the first time in their marriage, Elena felt genuinely afraid of him. The man she had shared a bed with for 20 years suddenly seemed like a stranger capable of anything. "Be very careful, Elena," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You're in a delicate situation right now. Your reputation, your security, your future. It all depends on your ability to be reasonable. I'd hate for you to do something you might regret." The threat was unmistakable, and it confirmed what Elena had begun to suspect, that Victor's affair with Sophia was more than just a midlife crisis. This was a calculated campaign to push her out of his life, to clear the way for a newer, younger model while keeping the assets they had built together. As Victor turned to leave, Elena made a decision that would change everything. "I want a divorce," she said, her voice carrying across the room with the authority of a judge delivering a verdict. Victor stopped in the doorway, his shoulders stiffening. When he turned back to face her, his expression was no longer cold, it was openly hostile. "No," he said simply. "You don't." "Actually, I do," Elena replied, her legal training taking over. "And under New York state law, I'm entitled to equitable distribution of our marital assets. Given that I contributed significantly to building your business and gave up my own career to support yours, I'd estimate my share at approximately 50% of our current net worth." Victor's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Elena, sweetheart, you seem to have forgotten something important. You have no money of your own? No career to go back to? No family to support you? Your parents are dead. You have no siblings. And all of our friends are really my friends. You're 48 years old, pregnant, and you haven't practiced law in 15 years. Who exactly do you think is going to hire you? What lawyer do you think will take your case against me?" Each word hit Elena like a physical blow because she recognized the truth in them. In supporting Victor's dream, she had isolated herself professionally and personally. Her old colleagues had moved on, her professional contacts had grown stale, and her identity had become so intertwined with being Mrs. Victor Harrington that she wasn't sure who Elena Harrington was anymore. But as Victor continued his verbal assault, describing her dependence on him in increasingly cruel terms, Elena felt something unexpected happening. Instead of crumbling under his attack, she found herself analyzing his strategy, identifying his weaknesses, and planning her counterattack. The analytical mind that had made her one of New York's most formidable attorneys was waking up after years of dormancy. "You're right about one thing," she said when he finished. "I don't have anything of my own right now, but you seem to be forgetting something important about me. Victor, I don't lose. I never have. And I'm not going to start now." Victor's confident smirk faltered slightly. For just a moment, Elena caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his eyes. "We'll see about that," he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had held moments before. After he left, Elena remained at the window, watching the dying embers of the fire that had consumed her clothes. As the last flames flickered out, she felt something inside her being reborn. The woman who had stood by silently while her husband betrayed and humiliated her was gone, burned away as surely as the maternity dresses in the patio fire. In her place stood Elena Harrington, attorney at law, and she had a case to win. the first step would be gathering evidence. Elena's legal mind began cataloging everything she would need: financial records, documentation of Victor's affair, proof of her contributions to the business, witnesses who could testify to the deterioration of their marriage. She thought about the private investigator she had once used in corporate cases, wondering if he was still in business. But as she began planning her strategy, Elena felt the baby kick strongly, as if responding to her renewed determination. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling a surge of protective love that went beyond anything she had ever experienced. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "Mommy's going to make sure we're both taken care of. Your father may have forgotten who he's dealing with, but he's about to get a very unpleasant reminder." Outside, and the garden was dark except for the dim glow of the estate's security lights. The fire that had burned her clothes was now just a pile of ash and cooling embers. But inside Elena Harrington, a different kind of fire was just beginning to burn, one that would not be so easily extinguished. As she prepared for bed that night, Elena caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her was still pregnant, still technically dependent on Victor for everything from the roof over her head to the credit cards in her wallet. But there was something different in her eyes now. Something Victor had clearly failed to recognize when he decided to wage war against her. He had awakened the attorney in her, the fighter who had never lost a case, the woman who had built his empire alongside him. And now that woman had a new client herself and a new case to win. It would be the most important trial of her career, with stakes higher than any corporate merger or hostile takeover she had ever negotiated. Victor thought he held all the cards, but Elena knew something he had forgotten in any game. It's not the hand you're dealt that matters, it's how skillfully you play it. And Elena Harrington was about to remind her husband exactly how skillful she could be. The war for her future, her dignity, and her child's security was about to begin. The law offices of Chen and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a midtown Manhattan building that Elena remembered from her practicing days. It wasn't the gleaming corporate tower where her old firm had been housed, but the modest reception area and worn leather furniture spoke of substance over style, exactly what Elena needed for what she was about to undertake. 3 days had passed since the fire. 3 days during which Victor had acted as though their confrontation had never happened. He left early each morning and returned late each evening, making no effort to hide his phone calls with Sophia or explain his frequent absences. The casual cruelty of his behavior was breathtaking. He was treating Elena like she was already a stranger in her own home. But those 3 days had not been wasted. Elena had used Victor's absence to begin the painstaking work of building her case. Her first call had been to Margaret Chen, a divorce attorney she had known peripherally from professional functions years ago. Margaret had been willing to see her immediately, though she had warned Elena that taking on Victor Harrington would be like going to war with a nuclear weapon using a slingshot. "Mrs. Harrington," Margaret said as Elena settled into the chair across from her desk, "I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about this? Your husband's reputation for destroying his opponents is well known in legal circles. He doesn't just win, he annihilates." Elena had spent 20 years watching Victor operate in the business world, and she knew Margaret was right. Victor's approach to conflict was scorched earth. He didn't just defeat his enemies. He eliminated them so thoroughly that they served as warnings to anyone else who might consider challenging him. She had seen him bankrupt competitors, destroy careers, and obliterate anyone who stood in his way. "I understand the risks," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her constantly now. "But I need you to understand something. Margaret, I'm not the society wife everyone thinks I am. Before I married Victor, I was Elena Rodriguez, and I never lost a case. Not one. I gave up my career to build his empire, but I didn't give up my skills or my intelligence. I just need someone willing to help me use them." Margaret studied Elena's face carefully. "What makes you think you can win against someone with Victor's resources?" Elena opened the leather portfolio she had brought with her. "Because I know where all the bodies are buried. I've been part of building his empire for 20 years. I know about the offshore accounts, the questionable acquisitions, the deals that push the boundaries of securities law. I know about the company expenses that were really personal luxuries, the tax strategies that might not hold up under scrutiny, and the employees who were pressured to keep quiet about his affairs. For the first time since Elena had entered her office, Margaret looked genuinely interested. That's a good start, but you need to understand that gathering evidence and proving it in court are two different things. Your husband will have the best legal team money can buy, and they'll come after you with everything they have. Then we'd better be prepared for them, Elena said. Over the next 2 hours, Elena and Margaret developed a preliminary strategy. The first priority was documenting Elena's contributions to the business, which would be crucial for establishing her claim to a significant portion of their assets. The second was gathering evidence of Victor's affair with Sophia, which would support her case for divorce on grounds of adultery. The third was protecting Elena herself. Margaret was genuinely concerned about what Victor might do once he realized Elena was serious about fighting him. He's already started psychological warfare, Elena explained, describing Victor's gaslighting attempts and threats. Last night he told me that if I insisted on being unreasonable, he might have to take steps to protect our family's reputation. When I asked what that meant, he suggested that my pregnancy might be affecting my mental stability. Margaret's expression darkened. That's a classic strategy for wealthy men in divorce proceedings claim the wife is mentally unstable, especially during pregnancy when hormonal changes can be used to support that narrative. We need to get you to a psychiatrist immediately for an evaluation that establishes your mental competence. As they concluded their meeting, Margaret had one final warning. Elena, I want you to understand what you're getting into. This isn't just going to be a legal battle. It's going to be psychological warfare. Victor will try to isolate you, intimidate you, and make you doubt yourself. He'll attack your credibility, your character, and your fitness as a mother. He'll use your pregnancy against you at every opportunity. Are you prepared for that? Elena thought about the baby growing inside her, about the future she wanted to build for both of them, about the 20 years she had invested in a marriage that Victor was now treating as disposable. I've been preparing for this my whole life, she said. I just didn't know it. Leaving Margaret's office, Elena felt both energized and terrified. The attorney in her was excited by the challenge, by the opportunity to use her skills in the highest stakes case of her career. But the woman in her was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was undertaking. She was about to go to war with one of the most powerful men in America, and she was doing it while 7 months pregnant and emotionally devastated by his betrayal. Her next stop was the office of James Morrison, the private investigator she had worked with on several corporate cases during her practicing days. His office was in a converted warehouse in Queens, a far cry from the gleaming towers of Manhattan, where Elena usually conducted business. But she knew his reputation for thoroughness and discretion. Elena Rodriguez, Morrison said as she entered his cluttered office. I heard you'd married Victor Harrington. I have to say, I'm surprised to see you here under these circumstances. Elena wasn't surprised that Morrison had already guessed why she was there. Private investigators made their living understanding human nature, and wealthy women seeking their services usually had the same basic story. I need everything you can find on Sofia Martinez, Elena said without preamble. Financial records, employment history, previous relationships, social media presence, travel records, everything. I also need detailed documentation of her relationship with my husband, photos, video if possible, witness statements, credit card records showing joint purchases or trips. Morrison nodded as he took notes. Timeline. I need preliminary findings within a week. Complete report within 2 weeks. Money is no object. Mrs. Harrington, Morrison said carefully, I need to warn you about something. Your husband's company has extensive security resources, including digital surveillance capabilities. If he discovers you're investigating him, things could get unpleasant very quickly. Elena had considered this. Victor's company had developed some of the most sophisticated digital security systems in the world, and she knew he wouldn't hesitate to use those resources against her if he felt threatened. Then we'll have to be very careful, won't we? She said. From Morrison's office, Elena drove to a branch of Chase Bank in Midtown, one where she and Victor didn't normally conduct business. She had spent the morning reviewing their financial situation, and what she had discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The encouraging news was that their assets were even larger than she had realized. In addition to their primary residence in Manhattan, they owned homes in the Hamptons, Aspen, and Martha's Vineyard. Victor's company stock alone was worth over $6 billion, and they had additional investments in real estate, art, and other ventures that brought their total net worth to somewhere around $8 billion. The terrifying news was that almost all of it was in Victor's name, or controlled by trusts and corporate entities that he managed. Elena had access to several credit cards and a checking account with about $50,000. But Victor could cut off her access to those resources with a single phone call. At the bank, Elena opened her own checking and savings accounts, transferring the maximum amount she could from their joint account without triggering automatic alerts that might notify Victor. It wasn't much, only $10,000, but it would give her some financial independence while she planned her next moves. As she left the bank, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Victor. "Having dinner with the Singapore investors tonight. Don't wait up." Elena knew there were no Singapore investors. Victor's calendar, which she had managed for years, showed no such meeting. He wasn't even trying to hide his lies anymore, which told her everything she needed to know about how little he respected her. But two could play that game. Elena typed back, "Of course, darling. I'll probably turn in early anyway. Been feeling a bit tired lately." Let him think she was the passive, defeated wife he wanted her to be. It would make her counterattack that much more effective. That evening, Elena sat in the study that had once been her favorite room in their Manhattan penthouse. The walls were lined with books she and Victor had collected together during their travels, first editions from London, philosophy texts from Paris, history books from Rome. This room had been where they had spent countless evenings in the early years of their marriage, discussing books and ideas, dreaming about the future they would build together. Now it felt like a mausoleum of their dead relationship. Elena opened her laptop and began the methodical work of documenting her contributions to Victor's business. She started with the early years, when she had quite literally drafted the contracts that had secured their first major funding. She had negotiated the terms of their initial public offering, structured the acquisitions that had allowed them to expand internationally, and advised on the intellectual property strategies that had protected their most valuable innovations. As the years had progressed and Victor's company had grown larger, Elena's role had become less formal but no less important. She had used her legal expertise to review major contracts, her social connections to facilitate business relationships, and her intuitive understanding of people to help Victor navigate complex negotiations. More importantly, she had been instrumental in building Victor's public image. His transformation from a somewhat abrasive tech entrepreneur to a respected business leader and philanthropist had been largely Elena's work. She had coached him on public speaking, helped him develop the charitable foundation that had enhanced his reputation, and used her own connections in the legal and philanthropic communities to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Elena began creating a detailed timeline of her contributions, cross-referencing them with the growth in Victor's company's value. What she found was striking: the periods of her most intense involvement in the business coincided directly with their most dramatic growth spurts. Her legal expertise had been worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the company, and her strategic guidance had been worth even more. But proving her contributions in court would require more than her own testimony. Elena began reaching out to former employees, business partners, and industry contacts who could testify to her role in building the company. Some of the conversations were awkward. Many people were clearly uncomfortable with the idea of testifying against Victor Harrington, but others were more encouraging. "Elena," said Patricia Williams, Victor's former chief operating officer, "I've been waiting for years for someone to recognize your contributions to that company. Victor takes credit for everything, but those of us who were there know the truth. That international expansion that made him billions, that was your strategy. The IP portfolio that protects their core technology. You built that. I'd be happy to testify to that fact." By midnight, Elena had contacted 8 former employees and business associates. 5 had agreed to provide testimony supporting her claims. 2 had refused to get involved, and 1 hadn't responded yet. It was a good start, but Elena knew she would need more. As she prepared for bed, Elena felt the baby moving actively inside her, as if responding to her stress and determination. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling a surge of protective love mixed with fierce determination. "I'm going to make sure you never have to be ashamed of your mother," she whispered. "Your father may think he can throw us away like we're nothing, but he's about to learn that we're not going anywhere without a fight." The next morning brought an unpleasant surprise. Elena woke to find Victor in the kitchen, fully dressed in a business suit despite the early hour, pouring coffee with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for battle. "Good morning, Elena," he said without looking at her. "We need to talk." Elena poured herself a glass of orange juice, using the time to study Victor's expression. His face was set in the mask of cold authority she had seen him use in his most ruthless business negotiations. "What about?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I've been doing some thinking about our conversation the other night," Victor said, finally looking directly at her. "About your concerns regarding our marriage. I think it would be best for everyone if we could resolve this situation quietly and amicably." Elena almost laughed at his choice of words. "Resolve this situation? Is that what we're calling 20 years of marriage now? A situation to be resolved?" Victor's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that her words had affected him. "Elena, let's be realistic. You're upset about Sophia, and I understand that. But you have to recognize that our marriage has been essentially over for years. We've grown apart. We want different things from life, and pretending otherwise isn't healthy for either of us." "Different things," Elena repeated. "Like not wanting your spouse to have affairs? Like expecting loyalty and respect from the person you've built a life with?" "Yes, I suppose those are pretty unreasonable expectations." "Don't be dramatic," Victor said dismissively. "I'm offering you a generous settlement. You can keep the Hamptons house. I'll provide you with a monthly allowance that will ensure you never have to worry about money, and we can work out a reasonable custody arrangement for the baby." Elena stared at her husband in disbelief. "A monthly allowance, Victor? I helped build your empire. I gave up my career, my independence, my entire identity to support your dreams. And now you're offering me an allowance like I'm a teenager who needs spending money." Victor's expression hardened. "Elena, you need to think very carefully about how you proceed here. I'm being generous, but my generosity has limits. You have no idea what a public divorce battle would cost you, not just financially, but personally. I can afford the best lawyers, the best public relations firms, the best of everything. Can you?" The threat was clear, and Elena felt a chill run down her spine. But she also felt something else, anger so pure and focused that it seemed to burn away her fear. "You know what, Victor? You're absolutely right. I can't afford the best lawyers or the best public relations firms, but I have something you seem to have forgotten about. I have the truth, and in my experience, the truth has a way of winning, even against billion-dollar legal teams." Victor's coffee cup hit the marble countertop with a sharp crack. "The truth, Elena. The truth is that you haven't worked in 15 years. The truth is that you have no independent income, no professional contacts, no way to support yourself without me. The truth is that you're 48 years old, pregnant, and completely dependent on my goodwill. So before you start making threats about the truth, maybe you should consider what your truth actually looks like to the outside world." Each word was designed to wound, to make Elena feel powerless and desperate. A month ago, they might have worked, but the woman standing in the kitchen now was not the same woman who had watched her clothes burn 3 days earlier. "You want to know what my truth looks like," Elena said, her voice deadly calm. "My truth is that I helped build a company worth $8 billion. My truth is that I sacrificed my own career to advance yours. My truth is that I'm the mother of your child, and I'm going to fight for that child's future with everything I have." And my truth is that I'm done letting you treat me like I'm disposable. Victor studied Elena's face for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in years. What he saw there must have surprised him, because some of the arrogance left his expression. Elena, he said, his voice softer now, I don't want to hurt you, but if you force me to choose between being kind and protecting what I've built, I'll choose my business every time. Don't make me prove that to you. Too late, Elena said. You already have. After Victor left for the office, Elena sat alone in their kitchen, surrounded by the luxurious appointments of their penthouse custom cabinetry, imported marble countertops, state-of-the-art appliances that had been featured in Architectural Digest. All of it felt like props in a play she was no longer willing to perform in. Her phone rang, and Margaret Chen's name appeared on the screen. Elena, we need to meet today. I've been doing some preliminary research on your husband's business practices, and there are some things you need to know immediately. 2 hours later, Elena was back in Margaret's office, listening to information that made her feel sick to her stomach. Your husband's company has been under investigation by the SEC for the past 6 months, Margaret explained, sliding a folder across her desk. Nothing has been made public yet, but my sources tell me it involves questionable accounting practices related to some of their international acquisitions. Elena opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. As someone who had helped structure many of Victor's deals, she could see immediately what the SEC was concerned about. Several acquisitions had been structured in ways that artificially inflated the company's revenue while hiding significant liabilities. There's more, Margaret continued. The IRS has been conducting a quiet audit of your personal tax returns for the past year. Apparently, some of the charitable deductions claimed by your family foundation don't match the foundation's actual expenditures. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She had managed the foundation's finances for years, and while she had always been scrupulously honest, Victor had occasionally pressured her to classify personal expenses as charitable activities. Margaret, are you saying that Victor is under criminal investigation? It's possible. The timing of his affair with Sophia might not be coincidental. If he's expecting to face serious legal problems, he might be trying to distance himself from you to protect his assets and minimize his legal exposure. Elena sank back in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what she was hearing. If Victor was facing criminal charges, a divorce could be the least of their problems, but it also meant that he was more vulnerable than she had realized. What does this mean for my case? She asked. Margaret smiled for the first time since Elena had known her. It means, Mrs. Harrington, that your husband just gave you the ammunition you need to win this war. As Elena left Margaret's office for the second time in a week, she felt like she was seeing the world differently. The man she had been married to for 20 years, the father of her unborn child, was not just an unfaithful husband, he was potentially a criminal who was willing to destroy her to save himself. But Elena was no longer the naive woman who had trusted him blindly. She was a fighter who had just discovered that her opponent had made a critical mistake. Victor thought he was dealing with a dependent wife who would be too frightened and overwhelmed to challenge him effectively. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The war was just beginning, and Elena Harrington intended to win. The revelation about Victor's legal troubles changed everything. Elena spent the next week in a state of controlled fury, methodically building a case that would not only secure her financial future, but potentially protect her from the criminal investigation that seemed to be closing in on her husband. Margaret had been right about the timing. Victor's affair with Sophia wasn't just about midlife crisis or wandering affections. It was about survival. If Victor was expecting to face criminal charges, distancing himself from Elena made perfect sense from a legal perspective. By portraying their marriage as irretrievably broken and Elena as mentally unstable, he could argue that she was not a reliable witness to his business practices and that any incriminating evidence she might possess was the product of a vindictive ex-wife. But Victor had made a crucial miscalculation. In his arrogance, he had assumed that Elena would be too devastated and dependent to fight back effectively. He had forgotten that she wasn't just Mrs. Victor Harrington, she was Elena Rodriguez, one of the most formidable attorneys of her generation, and she had access to 20 years' worth of information about his business dealings. Elena's first priority was protecting herself from any potential criminal liability. She scheduled an immediate meeting with a criminal defense attorney, David Kim, who had a reputation for representing white-collar defendants. After reviewing the documents Margaret had obtained about the SEC investigation, David's assessment was sobering but not hopeless. Mrs. Harrington, based on what I'm seeing here, it's possible that you could be named as a co-conspirator in some of these schemes, particularly related to the foundation finances, David explained. However, your role appears to have been primarily administrative rather than strategic. If we can establish that you were following your husband's instructions and had no knowledge of any fraudulent intent, we should be able to keep you clear of any serious charges. But David, Elena said, I did know about some of the questionable classifications. Victor asked me to categorize certain personal expenses as charitable activities, and I went along with it because I trusted his judgment. Doesn't that make me complicit? David considered this carefully. It could, but there's a difference between following your spouse's financial guidance and actively participating in a criminal conspiracy. The key will be demonstrating that you were acting in good faith based on information provided by your husband and that you had no independent knowledge of any broader fraudulent scheme. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of Elena's life. David explained that her best protection against criminal liability would be to cooperate fully with the investigation, providing information about Victor's business practices in exchange for immunity from prosecution. In other words, she would need to become a witness against her husband. I know this is painful, David said gently, but you need to understand that your husband has already made his choice. He's trying to position you as the fall guy for financial irregularities that you had minimal involvement in creating. Your loyalty to him could cost you your freedom and your ability to raise your child. Elena left David's office feeling like the foundation of her entire adult life had crumbled beneath her feet. The man she had loved and supported for 20 years was not only betraying her emotionally, he was preparing to sacrifice her legally to save himself. But as devastating as this realization was, it also clarified Elena's path forward. Victor had declared war on her, and she was going to respond with every weapon at her disposal. Elena's next move was to secure the evidence that would be crucial for both her divorce case and her protection from criminal prosecution. Over the years, she had maintained meticulous records of the family foundation's activities, Victor's business communications, and their personal financial transactions. Those records were stored in a combination of physical files in their home office and digital files on their shared computer network. Getting access to this information without alerting Victor required careful planning. Elena knew that their home computer system was monitored by the security software from Victor's company, so any unusual activity would likely be flagged. She would need to be strategic about what she accessed and when. Elena chose a Tuesday morning when Victor was scheduled to be in Philadelphia for a board meeting. She had confirmed his travel plans by checking his calendar and had verified through Morrison, her private investigator, that Victor had indeed traveled to Philadelphia and checked into his hotel. Working quickly but methodically, Elena began copying files from their shared computer system onto a series of encrypted flash drives. She focused on 3 categories of information financial records that documented her contributions to Victor's business success: communications that revealed the extent of his affair with Sophia, and business documents that might be relevant to the SEC investigation. The financial records told a story that even Elena hadn't fully appreciated. Her legal work during the early years of Victor's company had been worth millions of dollars in avoided legal fees and optimized deal structures. Her strategic guidance had been instrumental in at least 12 major acquisitions that had added billions to the company's value. Her social connections had opened doors to investors and partnerships that had been crucial to the company's international expansion. More importantly, Elena discovered that several of Victor's most celebrated business decisions had actually originated from her suggestions. The company's expansion into European markets, which business magazines had hailed as Victor's strategic genius, had been Elena's idea. developed through her connections in the international legal community. The acquisition of a smaller competitor that had eliminated a major threat to Victor's market position had been Elena's suggestion. Based on her analysis of patent filings and market trends, Elena had always known she had contributed to Victor's success, but seeing the documentation laid out in black and white was revelation. She hadn't just been a supportive wife, she had been an uncredited partner whose intellectual contributions had been worth billions of dollars. The communications Elena uncovered about Victor's affair were even more damaging than she had expected. Email chains between Victor and Sophia revealed that their relationship had been going on for over 2 years, much longer than Elena had suspected. More damaging still, the communications showed that Victor had been using company resources to support Sophia's lifestyle, including paying for her apartment, her travel, and even investing company funds in her fashion consulting business. But the most shocking discovery was a series of emails between Victor and Sophia discussing Elena herself. Victor had described his wife in terms so cruel and dismissive that Elena had to stop reading several times to compose herself. He had called her deadweight, complained about her neediness, and discussed strategies for managing the Elena problem with the same cold calculation he might use to plan a corporate restructuring. In one particularly devastating email, Victor had written to Sophia, "Don't worry about Elena. She's too dependent and scared to cause any real problems. I've been supporting her for 15 years, and she knows she has no options without me. Once the baby is born, we can accelerate our timeline for getting rid of her." Elena read that email 3 times, each reading making her more angry and more determined. Victor had been planning to discard her like an outdated piece of equipment, assuming she would be too broken and helpless to fight back. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The business documents Elena uncovered were the most complex but potentially the most valuable for her legal protection. She found email chains discussing the accounting treatments that the SEC was now investigating, including Victor's explicit instructions to company CFO about how to structure transactions to meet revenue targets. She discovered documentation of the questionable charitable deductions, including Victor's written guidance to her about classifying personal expenses as foundation activities. Most importantly, Elena found evidence that Victor had been aware of the legal risks associated with these practices and had made conscious decisions to proceed anyway. In one email to his general counsel, Victor had written, "I understand the risks, but the upside justifies proceeding. Make sure Elena handles the foundation paperwork. Her signature provides us with plausible deniability if anyone ever questions these classifications." Elena stared at that email for a long time, feeling a mixture of rage and relief. Rage that Victor had deliberately positioned her to take the blame for his questionable decisions, and relief that she now had documented proof of his intent to use her as a scapegoat. By the end of the day, Elena had copied over 200 documents onto encrypted flash drives. She made multiple copies of everything, storing them in different locations, including a safety deposit box she had opened under her maiden name. If Victor thought he could destroy the evidence of his crimes and her contributions, he was going to be disappointed. Elena's phone rang as she was finishing her document review. Margaret Chen's name appeared on the screen. "Elena, we have a problem," Margaret said without preamble. "Victor's lawyers have filed a motion for temporary spousal support and exclusive use of the marital residence. They're claiming that your mental state poses a danger to yourself and the baby, and they want you out of the house within 48 hours. Elena felt her heart rate spike. On what grounds? They're citing your erratic behavior, including what they're calling paranoid accusations about your husband's fidelity and delusional beliefs about your contributions to his business. They have a psychiatrist who's willing to testify that pregnant women are particularly susceptible to paranoid episodes, and they're arguing that the stress of living together is endangering your pregnancy." Elena sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the audacity of Victor's strategy. He was using her pregnancy, their child, as a weapon against her, portraying her natural responses to his betrayal as symptoms of mental illness. "Margaret, this is outrageous. I've done nothing erratic or dangerous. My accusations about his affair aren't paranoid. They're documented facts, and my contributions to his business are verifiable through corporate records. I know that, and we'll prove it in court. But Elena, you need to understand that Victor is playing for keeps here. This motion is designed to isolate you, cut off your access to your home and support system, and establish a narrative of mental instability that he can use throughout the divorce proceedings. Elena took a deep breath, forcing herself to think strategically rather than emotionally. What do we need to do? We fight back, and we fight back hard. I need you to get a complete psychiatric evaluation immediately to establish your mental competence. I also need documented proof of Victor's affair and evidence of your contributions to the business. Can you provide those things? Elena smiled for the first time in days. Margaret, you're not going to believe what I've spent today collecting. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning in Manhattan Family Court. Elena arrived at the courthouse with Margaret, David Kim, and a thick folder of evidence that would fundamentally change the trajectory of her case. Victor was already there with his legal team, 3 attorneys from one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms, led by Robert Sterling, a man whose reputation for ruthless tactics was legendary even among New York's aggressive legal community. Victor himself looked calm and confident, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit that projected authority and respectability. As Elena took her seat at the plaintiff's table, Victor caught her eye and smiled coldly. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won, who was confident that his resources and connections would overwhelm any resistance she might offer. Elena smiled back, and she had the satisfaction of seeing Victor's expression flicker with the first hint of uncertainty. Judge Patricia Morrison called the hearing to order, and Robert Sterling rose to present Victor's motion. His argument was smooth and professional, painting a picture of a troubled woman whose pregnancy had triggered paranoid delusions about her devoted husband's fidelity and her own importance to his business success. Your Honor, Sterling said, Mrs. Harrington's recent behavior has become increasingly concerning. She has made wild accusations about her husband's fidelity based on no evidence beyond her own suspicions. She has claimed credit for business decisions and strategies that were clearly the result of her husband's genius and leadership. Most troubling, she has become fixated on conspiracy theories about investigations and legal problems that simply don't exist. Elena listened to Sterling's presentation with growing anger, but also with professional admiration for his skill. He was constructing a narrative that portrayed every legitimate concern she had raised as evidence of mental instability, every documented fact as a delusion. But Sterling had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed that Elena would be too intimidated or unprepared to respond effectively to his attack. When Margaret rose to present Elena's response, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted immediately. Your Honor, Margaret began, Mr. Sterling has presented a compelling narrative, but it has one fatal flaw: it's not true. Mrs. Harrington's accusations about her husband's affair are not paranoid delusions. They are documented facts. Margaret approached the bench with a thick folder. Your Honor, I present Exhibits A through G photographs of Mr. Harrington and Ms. Sophia Martinez engaged in intimate behavior at restaurants, hotels, and other locations throughout the past 2 years. Exhibit H contains credit card records showing that Mr. Harrington has spent over $200,000 on Ms. Martinez's living expenses, travel, and business investments. Exhibit I contains email communications between Mr. Harrington and Ms. Martinez discussing their relationship and their plans for ending Mr. Harrington's marriage. Elena watched Victor's face as Margaret presented each piece of evidence. His confident smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of growing concern. But Margaret was just getting started. Furthermore, Your Honor, Mrs. Harrington's claims about her contributions to her husband's business are not delusional fantasies. They are documented historical facts. I present Exhibits J through Z corporate communications, legal documents, and business records that establish Mrs. Harrington's instrumental role in building her husband's empire. As Margaret methodically presented the evidence Elena had gathered, the power dynamic in the courtroom shifted completely. Victor's lawyers huddled together in whispered conferences, clearly unprepared for the level of documentation Elena had provided. The final blow came when Margaret addressed Sterling's claims about Elena's mental state. Your Honor, Mr. Sterling has suggested that Mrs. Harrington is suffering from pregnancy-related paranoia. I present the court with a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted by Dr. Sarah Williams, one of New York's most respected forensic psychiatrists. Dr. Williams' report concludes that Mrs. Harrington shows no signs of paranoia, delusion, or mental instability. In fact, Dr. Williams notes that Mrs. Harrington's responses to her situation show remarkable psychological resilience and clarity of thought. Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence for several minutes before rendering her decision. Mr. Sterling, your client's motion is denied. The evidence presented demonstrates that Mrs. Harrington's concerns about her marriage are well-founded and that her claims about her professional contributions are supported by documentation. There is no credible evidence of mental instability or danger to herself or her child. Mrs. Harrington will remain in the marital residence, and I'm ordering both parties to refrain from any actions that could be construed as intimidation or harassment. As the court session concluded, Elena felt a surge of triumph unlike anything she had experienced in her legal career. She had not only defeated Victor's first major attack, she had demonstrated that she was not the helpless victim he had assumed her to be. But as she gathered her papers and prepared to leave the courthouse, Elena caught sight of Victor's face. The confident businessman who had entered the courtroom that morning was gone, replaced by a man who looked genuinely dangerous. Elena realized that while she had won this battle, the war was far from over, and Victor was not going to make the mistake of underestimating her again. As she walked out of the courthouse with Margaret and David, Elena placed a protective hand on her belly, feeling the baby moving inside her. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "Mommy just proved that we're not going anywhere without a fight." The real battle was just beginning. The weeks following Elena's courtroom victory brought a deceptive calm that she knew was merely the eye of an approaching storm. Victor had returned to their penthouse that evening after the hearing. His demeanor changed completely from the confident predator she had faced in court. He was polite, distant, conducting their interactions with the formal courtesy of strangers sharing an elevator. But Elena wasn't fooled by his apparent acceptance of defeat. She had spent 20 years watching Victor respond to setbacks in business, and she knew his patterns. He would retreat, regroup, and return with a strategy designed to overwhelm any opposition. The only question was what form his counterattack would take. Elena used this period of relative peace to strengthen her position further. Morrison's investigation into Sophia Martinez had uncovered information that added crucial context to Victor's affair. Sophia wasn't just a beautiful woman who had caught Victor's attention. She was a sophisticated operator who had specifically targeted wealthy, older men throughout her adult life. Mrs. Harrington, Morrison explained during their meeting in his Queen's office. Sophia Martinez has a very interesting history. She's been involved with at least 3 other wealthy men in the past decade, and each relationship followed a similar pattern. She would befriend the wife, gain the family's trust, then seduce the husband. In 2 cases, the marriages ended in divorce, with the husband providing substantial financial settlements to both his wife and to Sophia. Elena studied the photographs Morrison had provided Sophia with: a real estate mogul in Miami, a pharmaceutical executive in Boston, and an entertainment industry lawyer in Los Angeles. In each case, Sophia had extracted significant money from the relationship before moving on to her next target. "So Victor isn't her first billionaire?" Elena observed. "No, but he's definitely her biggest catch. Based on the financial records I've been able to access, Victor has already transferred over $5 million to accounts controlled by Sophia. Most of it has been structured as investments in her consulting business, but the business doesn't appear to have any legitimate operations." Elena felt a mixture of disgust and professional admiration for Sophia's strategy. She had positioned herself not as a mistress seeking support, but as a business partner deserving investment. It was a sophisticated approach that provided legal protection while maximizing financial gain. "Morrison, I need you to document everything about Sophia's previous relationships. I want testimony from the other wives if possible, financial records showing the pattern of her behavior, anything that establishes her as a professional predator rather than an innocent woman who fell in love. As Morrison continued his investigation, Elena focused on building her case for the divorce proceedings. Margaret had warned her that Victor's counterattack would likely focus on minimizing Elena's contributions to the business while maximizing his own importance. They needed witnesses who could testify to Elena's crucial role in building the company, and those witnesses needed to be people Victor couldn't intimidate or buy off. Elena's most important ally turned out to be someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Dr. James Patterson, Victor's first major investor and the man who had provided the seed funding that allowed Victor's company to grow from a startup to a major corporation. Dr. Patterson was now in his 70s, wealthy enough to be immune to Victor's influence, and still bitter about how Victor had pushed him out of the company once it became successful. "Elena," Dr. Patterson said when she called him, "I've been waiting for someone to call Victor out on his revisionist history about building that company. The truth is, you were instrumental in every major decision during those early years. Victor had the vision, but you had the business sense and legal expertise to make it happen." Dr. Patterson agreed not only to testify on Elena's behalf, but to provide access to his personal files from the early days of Victor's company files that contained contemporaneous documentation of Elena's role in crucial business decisions. "Victor has spent years taking credit for your ideas," Dr. Patterson explained when they met at his estate in Connecticut. "That international expansion strategy that made him billions. That was your concept, based on your analysis of European patent law, the acquisition of Brennan Technologies that eliminated their biggest competitor. You identified that opportunity and structured the deal. Victor implemented your strategies, but he never acknowledged your contributions." Elena found herself crying as she reviewed Dr. Patterson's files, not from sadness, but from relief at finally having someone acknowledge the work she had done. For years, she had watched Victor receive praise for decisions that had originated from her analysis and recommendations, and she had convinced herself that her role as his behind-the-scenes advisor was sufficient recognition. Now, seeing her contributions documented in Dr. Patterson's meticulous records, Elena realized how thoroughly Victor had erased her from the story of their shared success. It wasn't just that he had failed to credit her, he had actively rewritten history to position himself as the sole architect of his empire. But Dr. Patterson's files also revealed something else that would be crucial for Elena's case. During the early years of the company, Victor had signed a partnership agreement that designated Elena as a strategic advisor with an ownership stake in any intellectual property she helped develop. The agreement had been superseded by later corporate restructuring, but the original document established a legal foundation for Elena's claim to a significant portion of Victor's wealth. As Elena's case grew stronger, she began to notice subtle changes in Victor's behavior that suggested he was planning something significant. He had started working even longer hours, often staying at the office until well past midnight. He had canceled several upcoming social engagements, claiming he needed to focus on business. Most tellingly, he had begun moving money between accounts in ways that Elena recognized as preparation for major financial restructuring. Elena's suspicions were confirmed when David Kim called her with urgent news about the criminal investigation. "Elena, the SEC investigation has accelerated dramatically. My sources tell me that federal prosecutors are preparing to file charges within the next 30 days, and Victor's name is at the top of their target list." "What does that mean for my divorce case?" Elena asked. "It means Victor is running out of time to protect his assets through legal restructuring. If he's going to try to hide money or transfer ownership of his companies, he needs to do it before the criminal charges are filed. Once he's indicted, all of his assets will be subject to forfeiture proceedings." Elena felt a chill of understanding. Victor's recent behavior wasn't just about their divorce, he was preparing for criminal charges that could cost him everything. And if he was desperate enough, he might be willing to take extreme measures to protect himself. "David," What kind of extreme measures might Victor consider? David's pause was long enough to confirm Elena's worst fears. Elena, wealthy men facing criminal prosecution have been known to consider very drastic steps to protect their assets and their freedom. I think you should consider whether staying in the same house with Victor is safe for you and your baby. That conversation took place on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, Elena had decided to implement an emergency plan she had been developing for weeks. She would gather the most crucial evidence, move to a secure location, and file for an immediate restraining order that would prevent Victor from accessing their shared assets. But Victor moved first. Elena woke Saturday morning to find Victor already dressed and packing a suitcase in their bedroom. Her first thought was relief if he was leaving voluntarily. It would simplify her own security concerns. "Going somewhere?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Victor looked up from his packing, and Elena was struck by how much he had changed in recent weeks. The confident, commanding presence that had defined him for as long as she had known him was gone, replaced by something desperate and dangerous. "Business trip," he said shortly. "Singapore investors want to accelerate the timeline on the expansion project." Elena knew there was no Singapore expansion project. She also knew that Victor's passport had been flagged by federal authorities as part of the criminal investigation, making international travel impossible without court approval. "How long will you be gone?" she asked. Victor's smile was cold and knowing. "That depends on how things develop here. Could be a few days, could be longer." As Victor finished packing, Elena noticed he was taking more than he would need for a business trip. He had packed enough clothes for several weeks, along with personal items that suggested he might not be planning to return. After Victor left, Elena immediately called Margaret and David, arranging an emergency meeting at Margaret's office. As she prepared to leave the penthouse, Elena felt the baby moving restlessly inside her, as if responding to her stress and anxiety. "I know, little one," she whispered, placing her hands on her belly. "Mommy's scared too. But we're going to get through this together." Elena arrived at Margaret's office to find both her attorneys reviewing a stack of documents with grave expressions. "Elena," Margaret said as soon as she entered the conference room, "we have a problem. Victor's lawyers filed motions yesterday afternoon that we're just seeing this morning. He's claiming that you've been embezzling money from the family foundation and using it to fund your divorce proceedings. He's also requesting an emergency psychiatric evaluation, claiming that your behavior has become increasingly erratic and potentially dangerous." Elena sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the audacity of Victor's accusations. "Margaret, that's completely false. Every penny I've spent on legal fees has come from my personal account or from our joint account that I have legitimate access to." "I know that," Margaret said, "but Victor has presented financial records that seem to show irregularities in the foundation's accounts. The records are clearly manipulated, but proving that will take time we don't have." David leaned forward across the conference table. "Elena, there's something else you need to know. Victor's business partner contacted me this morning. Apparently, Victor has been liquidating company assets and transferring money to offshore accounts. If the federal prosecutors move quickly enough, they might be able to freeze those accounts. But Victor has had months to prepare for this." Elena felt a surge of anger that overwhelmed her fear. "So he's been planning this for months. The affair, the divorce, the criminal investigation. He's been preparing to abandon everything and start over with Sophia while leaving me to face the consequences of his crimes." "It looks that way," Margaret confirmed. "But Elena, we're not helpless here. The evidence you've gathered gives us significant leverage, and Victor's recent behavior actually strengthens our case. By liquidating assets and making false accusations against you, he's demonstrating exactly the kind of desperate, unethical behavior that supports your claims about his character." Over the next several hours, Elena's legal team developed a comprehensive response to Victor's latest attack. They would file counter motions challenging his accusations and requesting an immediate forensic audit of all financial accounts. They would present the evidence of his affair and his embezzlement of company funds to support Sophia's lifestyle. Most importantly, they would request an emergency hearing to freeze all marital assets until the court could determine their proper distribution. But as they worked on their legal strategy, Elena began to realize that the situation had moved beyond the scope of normal divorce proceedings. Victor was no longer just trying to win a favorable settlement. He was fighting for his freedom and his entire fortune, and a man with that much to lose might be willing to consider options that went far beyond legal maneuvering. Elena's concerns were validated that evening when Morrison called with disturbing news. Mrs. Harrington, Victor didn't take a commercial flight to Singapore. In fact, he didn't fly anywhere yesterday, but I did track him to a private airfield in New Jersey, where he met with several men whose backgrounds suggest they're not legitimate businessmen. Elena felt her blood turn cold. What kind of men? The kind who solve problems for wealthy people without asking too many questions about legality. Mrs. Harrington, I think you need to consider the possibility that Victor might be planning something more drastic than financial manipulation. You think he would actually try to hurt me? Morrison's pause was answer enough. Mrs. Harrington, I think you need to disappear for a while. Somewhere Victor can't find you. Somewhere you'll be safe until this situation resolves itself. That night, Elena packed a single suitcase with her most essential belongings and drove to a hotel near LaGuardia Airport under a false name. As she settled into the anonymous room, Elena felt the baby moving inside her and realized that she was no longer just fighting for her financial future. She was fighting for their lives. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, Elena felt something else stirring within her. The woman who had built a legal career on never backing down from a fight, the attorney who had never lost a case, the strategic mind that had helped build a billion-dollar empire, all of these aspects of herself were awakening with a clarity and focus she hadn't felt in years. Victor had made a crucial mistake. In his desperation to protect himself, he had reminded Elena exactly who she was and what she was capable of. He had awakened the fighter in her, and now she was going to show him exactly why that was the worst tactical error of his life. The next morning, Elena made a series of phone calls that would change everything. First, she called David Kim and authorized him to contact federal prosecutors with an offer of cooperation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Second, she called Margaret and instructed her to file for an immediate restraining order and asset freeze. Third, she called Morrison and asked him to arrange for personal security, but the most important call was to Dr. Patterson, asking him to arrange a meeting with someone he had mentioned during their previous conversation, an investigative journalist who had been researching corruption in the tech industry. Elena, Dr. Patterson said, are you sure you want to go public with this? Once this story breaks, there will be no going back to your old life. Elena looked at her reflection in the hotel room mirror, seeing a woman she was just beginning to recognize, someone who had found her strength in the midst of betrayal and was prepared to use it without reservation. James, she said, my old life is already over. Victor destroyed it when he decided I was disposable. Now I'm going to build a new one, and I'm going to make sure that everyone knows exactly who destroyed the old one. The war between Elena and Victor Harrington was about to become very public, and Elena intended to win it decisively. The conference room at the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan buzzed with an energy that Elena had rarely experienced, even during her most high-profile cases. Media representatives filled the gallery, their cameras focused on the witness table where she sat beside David Kim. Across the room, Victor's legal team occupied an entire row of seats, their expressions ranging from grim to desperate. 3 months had passed since Elena had fled to the airport hotel. 3 months during which the entire foundation of Victor's empire had crumbled with stunning speed. The story that broke in the Wall Street Journal, based on Elena's cooperation with investigative journalist Sarah Chen, had triggered a cascade of revelations that destroyed Victor's reputation and exposed the full scope of his criminal activities. The headlines had been devastating. Tech mogul's wife exposes massive fraud scheme. Billionaire's affair funded by embezzled corporate assets. Federal prosecutors build case with help from insider wife. But for Elena, the most satisfying headline had been in the New York Times, Elena Rodriguez Harrington, the attorney who brought down her husband's empire. The hearing today was the culmination of everything Elena had fought for, the final divorce proceedings that would determine the distribution of what remained of Victor's assets after the federal government had seized the majority of his wealth as proceeds from criminal activity. Victor himself was not present. He was currently in federal custody, awaiting trial on 37 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. Mrs. Harrington, Judge Patricia Morrison said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the packed courtroom. Before we proceed with the asset distribution, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary courage you've shown throughout these proceedings. Your cooperation with federal investigators has not only protected you and your child from legal jeopardy, but has also ensured that justice will be served for the investors and employees who were harmed by your husband's criminal activities. Elena nodded, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. She had won more completely than she had ever imagined possible, but the victory had come at the cost of everything she had believed about her life and marriage. Margaret Chen rose to present Elena's final claim to the court. Your Honor, Mrs. Harrington is requesting 50% of the remaining marital assets, which after federal asset forfeiture proceedings amounts to approximately $400 million. This request is based on her documented contributions to building the business that generated these assets, her sacrifice of her own career to support her husband's success, and her role in exposing the criminal activities that protected innocent investors from further harm. Robert Sterling, representing Victor's interests even in his absence, made one final attempt to minimize Elena's claims. Your Honor, while we acknowledge Mrs. Harrington's cooperation with federal authorities, we maintain that her contributions to the business have been overstated and that the asset distribution should reflect the reality that Victor Harrington was the primary architect of the company's success. Judge Morrison's response was swift and definitive. Mr. Sterling, this court has reviewed extensive documentation of Mrs. Harrington's contributions to her husband's business success. Moreover, the fact that she chose to expose his criminal activities rather than remain complicit speaks to both her integrity and her legitimate claim to the assets they built together. I'm awarding Mrs. Harrington 60% of the remaining marital assets, along with full custody of the minor child and ongoing spousal support. As the judge delivered her ruling, Elena felt a profound sense of closure that went beyond the financial victory. For months, she had been fighting not just for money, but for recognition of her worth, her contributions, and her right to determine her own future. The court's decision validated everything she had sacrificed and everything she had fought to reclaim. But the most meaningful moment came as Elena was leaving the courthouse. Waiting outside was a group of women she had never met, wives and ex-wives of other powerful men who had followed Elena's case and drawn inspiration from her courage to fight back. Mrs. Harrington, said a woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Patricia Walsh, I wanted to thank you for showing us that it's possible to stand up to these men and win. My husband has been having affairs for years, and I always thought I was too old and too dependent to do anything about it. Watching you fight gave me the courage to file my own divorce papers. Similar stories came from the other women accounts of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and years of feeling powerless against wealthy, connected husbands who assumed their wives would never have the courage or resources to challenge them. Elena realized that her very public battle with Victor had become something larger than a personal victory. It had become a symbol of hope for women who had felt trapped in impossible situations. As Elena drove home to the modest but comfortable apartment she had chosen in Chelsea, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. Gone was the palatial penthouse, the staff of domestic helpers, the endless round of social obligations that had defined her existence as Mrs. Victor Harrington. In their place was something far more valuable: freedom, independence, and the knowledge that she could survive and thrive on her own terms. Elena's apartment was small by the standards of her previous life, but it was entirely hers. She had furnished it with pieces that reflected her own taste rather than what would photograph well for magazines. The walls displayed artwork she had chosen because it moved her, not because it was a sound investment. The bookshelves held volumes she actually wanted to read. not coffee table books selected for their visual impact. Most importantly, the nursery she had prepared for her daughter was a place of warmth and love, rather than a showpiece designed to impress visitors. Elena had named her baby Grace Elena Rodriguez Harrington. Grace for the strength she had found in the midst of crisis, Elena to honor her own resilience, and Rodriguez to reclaim the identity she had temporarily lost in 20 years of marriage. Grace was now 3 months old, a healthy, beautiful baby whose very existence seemed to represent everything Elena had fought to protect. During the long nights of feeding and diaper changes, Elena often found herself talking to her daughter about the future they would build together. "We're going to be okay, sweet girl," Elena would whisper as Grace slept in her arms. "Mommy made sure of that. You're going to grow up knowing that women don't have to accept being treated as disposable, that we can fight for what we deserve, and that we can win." Elena's victory had indeed been complete, but not just in financial terms. The federal prosecutors had used Elena's testimony and the evidence she provided to build an overwhelming case against Victor. His conviction had been swift and decisive, resulting in a 25-year federal prison sentence and the permanent forfeiture of most of his assets. Sofia Martinez had also faced consequences for her role in Victor's schemes. The money she had received from Victor was seized as proceeds from criminal activity, and she had been charged as an accessory to his financial crimes. More satisfying to Elena. Sofia's reputation as a sophisticated socialite had been destroyed by the revelation of her history as a professional manipulator who targeted wealthy men. But perhaps the most important outcome was what Elena had discovered about herself during the long months of legal battles. The woman who had emerged from the wreckage of her marriage was stronger, more confident, and more authentically herself than the person she had been during 20 years of subordinating her identity to Victor's needs and ambitions. Elena had started a new law practice specializing in representing women in complex divorce cases, particularly those involving wealthy, powerful husbands who assumed their wives would be too intimidated to fight effectively. Her reputation for thorough preparation, strategic thinking, and absolute refusal to be intimidated had quickly made her one of the most sought-after divorce attorneys in New York. "You know," Margaret Chen had said during lunch a few weeks earlier, "you're becoming quite famous in legal circles. Other attorneys are calling your approach to high-conflict divorce cases the Harrington strategy, meaning you gather so much evidence and build such an airtight case that the opposition has no choice but to settle on your terms." Elena had smiled at that description. "It's not really a strategy, Margaret. It's just refusing to be underestimated or intimidated. Most of these wealthy men have gotten away with treating their wives badly because they assume we don't have the resources or the courage to fight back effectively. Once you show them that you're prepared to document everything and use every legal tool available, they usually discover they're not as untouchable as they thought." Elena's new practice had given her a sense of purpose that went beyond personal vindication. Every case she won, every settlement she negotiated, every woman she helped to reclaim her independence felt like a continuation of her own fight for dignity and justice. One particularly meaningful case involved representing the wife of a pharmaceutical executive who had been having an affair with his secretary for 5 years. The husband had tried to intimidate his wife by threatening to claim she was mentally unstable due to her depression medication. But Elena's thorough documentation of his affair and financial misconduct had resulted in a settlement that gave her client financial security and custody of their children. "Mrs. Harrington," the client had said after the settlement was finalized, "I don't know how to thank you for giving me my life back. 6 months ago, I thought I had no options except to accept my husband's treatment of me. Now I have my own home, my children, and enough money to never worry about my future." These conversations reminded Elena daily that her own victory had significance beyond her personal circumstances. By refusing to accept Victor's attempts to discard her, by fighting back with intelligence and determination, she had demonstrated that even the most powerful men could be held accountable for their actions. As Grace's first birthday approached, Elena found herself reflecting on the year that had transformed everything about her life. 12 months earlier, she had been Mrs. Victor Harrington, living in a penthouse and believing her marriage was merely going through a difficult period. Now she was Elena Rodriguez Harrington, successful attorney, single mother, and symbol of resistance for women facing similar challenges. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been sleepless nights filled with fear about her financial future, moments of profound loneliness as she adjusted to life without the social connections that had defined her for 20 years, and periods of doubt about whether she had the strength to build a new life from scratch. But there had also been moments of pure joy that Elena had never experienced during her marriage quiet Sunday mornings with Grace. Professional victories that belonged entirely to her own efforts. Friendships based on genuine connection rather than social obligation. And the deep satisfaction of knowing that she had saved herself and her daughter through her own courage and intelligence. The anniversary of Victor's arrest brought unexpected news: a letter from Victor himself, forwarded through his prison attorneys. Elena debated whether to read it, ultimately deciding that she owed herself closure on this chapter of her life. The letter was brief and, surprisingly, seemed genuinely remorseful. Elena, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing to seek it. I'm writing because I need to acknowledge what I now understand about our marriage and about the woman I was married to. For 20 years, you were my partner in every sense that mattered. You helped build everything I achieved, provided guidance that was worth billions of dollars, and supported my dreams even when it meant sacrificing your own. Instead of honoring that partnership, I treated you as expendable when it became convenient to do so. I convinced myself that you were weak and dependent, but the truth is that I was threatened by your strength and intelligence. I tried to diminish you because I was afraid that if you ever realized your own worth, you would no longer need me. I was right to be afraid. Once you decided to fight, I didn't stand a chance. You outmaneuvered me at every turn, exposed every weakness in my position, and defeated me more thoroughly than any business opponent ever has. Grace is lucky to have you as her mother. She will grow up knowing that women can be strong, intelligent, and capable of protecting themselves and the people they love. I will spend the rest of my life regretting how I treated you. But I am grateful that my failures led to you discovering exactly how formidable you are. Victor. Elena read the letter twice, feeling a complex mixture of emotions: anger at the years of manipulation and betrayal, sadness for the marriage that could have been, but most strongly, a sense of vindication and closure. She placed the letter in a file with the other documents from her divorce proceedings, then went to check on Grace, who was napping peacefully in her crib. Looking at her daughter's sleeping face, Elena felt a surge of fierce protectiveness and hope for the future. Your father finally understands what kind of woman your mother is, Elena whispered. And you, my beautiful girl, are going to grow up knowing from the very beginning that you are strong, valuable, and worthy of respect. No one will ever convince you that you're disposable, because I'm going to make sure you know better. As Elena prepared for another day at her law practice, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The woman who had stood at her bedroom window watching her clothes burn had felt powerless and defeated. The woman who now stood in her own apartment, preparing to help other women reclaim their lives, knew exactly how powerful she could be when necessary. Elena's victory over Victor had been complete, but more importantly, it had been transformative. She had not only won back her financial security and her dignity, she had discovered who she truly was when stripped of all the external trappings of wealth and status. The Elena Rodriguez who had graduated from law school 30 years earlier had been ambitious, intelligent, and determined. The Elena Rodriguez Harrington, who now practiced law in Manhattan, was all of those things, tempered by experience and strengthened by adversity. As she kissed Grace goodbye and headed to her office, Elena smiled at the thought that the best chapter of her story was just beginning. She had survived betrayal, fought for justice, and emerged stronger than she had ever imagined possible. And most importantly, she had proven to herself and to the world that no woman, no matter how dependent she might seem, no matter how powerful her opponent might be, ever has to accept being treated as disposable. Elena Rodriguez Harrington had won more than a divorce case. She had won back her life, her dignity, and her future, and that, she knew, was the most epic victory of all. Elena Rodriguez Harrington stood before the graduating class of Columbia Law School, her 5-year-old daughter Grace sitting in the front row with Elena's mother-in-law, who had flown in from Phoenix to attend the commencement address. "Future lawyers," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. "You are graduating into a profession that will test your integrity, your courage, and your commitment to justice. Some of you will face cases that challenge not just your legal skills, but your fundamental beliefs about right and wrong." Elena paused, looking out at the eager faces of the new graduates, remembering her own law school graduation 35 years earlier. "I want to tell you about the most important case I ever argued, not because it was the most legally complex, not because it generated the most media attention, but because it taught me that sometimes the client you're fighting hardest for is yourself." As Elena told her story carefully, thoughtfully, focusing on the legal strategies and the importance of thorough preparation, rather than the personal details, she saw recognition in many faces in the audience. Her case had become a landmark in family law, studied in law schools and cited in divorce proceedings across the country. "The lesson I want to leave you with," Elena concluded, "is that the law is not just a profession, it's a tool for protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Sometimes that person is a client who walks into your office. Sometimes it's a community that needs an advocate. And sometimes it's yourself, when you discover that the life you've been living is not the life you deserve." After the ceremony, Elena walked across campus with Grace, pointing out the buildings where she had studied, the library where she had spent countless hours preparing for exams, the courtyard where she had first dreamed of using her legal education to change the world. "Did you really beat Daddy in court, Mommy?" Grace asked, her 5-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of the story. Elena knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes, choosing her words carefully. "Daddy made some very bad choices that hurt a lot of people, including Mommy. So Mommy had to use her lawyer skills to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else, and to make sure we would be safe and taken care of. And you won." Elena smiled, thinking about all the different ways to define victory. "We won the most important thing, sweetheart. We won the right to live our own lives, make our own choices, and be proud of who we are." Grace nodded solemnly, then brightened. "When I grow up, I want to be a lawyer like you." "You can be anything you want to be," Elena said, hugging her daughter close. "But whatever you choose, you'll always know that you're strong enough to fight for what's right." As they walked toward the subway station, Elena reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. She had built a successful law practice, raised a confident daughter, and become an advocate for women facing situations similar to what she had endured. But most importantly, she had discovered that resilience wasn't just about surviving adversity. It was about using that adversity to become someone stronger and more authentic than you had ever been before. The woman who had once defined herself as Mrs. Victor Harrington now knew herself as Elena Rodriguez Harrington, attorney, mother, survivor, and fighter. And that knowledge, she understood, was worth more than any settlement, any victory, any external validation. Elena had won her case against Victor, but more importantly, she had won the case for herself, the right to be valued, respected, and treated as irreplaceable. And that victory would last for the rest of her life.